Hey, what's up? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to another comic art demonstration. In this video, I thought we'd mix things up today. We are working on a different concept that I also created for Rob Arnold for a new comic book that I don't think has been announced yet, actually. But basically, the general premise is that it is a sexy version of Star Trek. I mean, that's the general gist of it, and this is one of the characters that he asked me to decide on and develop the visual representation for, and I said, hey, why not? I like to draw beautiful, bodacious ladies, and I thought it would be a great practice run for me as well, because I think it had been a while since I'd actually drawn a full-body female character, so I wanted to test my mettle a little bit and make sure that I was still capable of doing that. You know, you spend a little time away from certain subject matters as an artist. You find that you haven't drawn it in a while, and it's nice to know that once you've shaken off the rust a little bit, that you do indeed still have the knowledge base there necessary to be able to tackle those subject matters again. The subject matter I'm talking about here being the female form. And you'll notice that regardless of the character that I'm ultimately going to end up designing, because she is a female character, and it would be the same deal if it was a male character, I'm basically starting out with a generic mannequin model for her. It's a female mannequin model, and it has female anatomy. It's very generally placed in there at the moment. I'm sketching up a number of views that I would like to tackle for this concept. It is a full character sheet that I'll be going over here and developing this character upon. So we're going to get a really nice, intimate look at exactly what her design is going to entail. And you can see just how rough I like to keep these drawings in the beginning, because they are apt to change. Like, there's certainly going to be tweaks and modifications that I do to this character along the way. So I don't want to get too refined early on. I don't want to get too precious about it, if you know what I mean, because, you know, if I become too attached to the first thing that I lay down onto the page, I'm going to be hesitant to change it. And who knows, if I'm hesitant enough not to change it, I may end up missing out on a much more ideal version of the design that I could have come up with. And, you know, the thing is, when it comes to designing a comic book character or a character for anything, really, any illustration that you set out to make, it's going to be an exploration process that inherently has a lot of erasing involved in order to get to that final outcome that you're trying to arrive at. It's a very rare occasion for me to start out and end up with a character without ever, a finished character, without ever having to erase or correct anything along the way. It just doesn't work like that. It's kind of the fantasy that all artists have. We like to, and we kind of doubt ourselves a lot as well when we find that we're just constantly erasing parts of the drawing away and re-putting it back in there. It's not just working out the way that we want it to. But you know what? I think that's always going to be an inherent part of what it is to be a comic book artist, or again, an artist of any kind. It's just, it's full of trial and error. There's going to be obstacles along the way, challenges that you have to face, even for the pros. And that is what keeps me immersed in the craft, that's for sure. You know, I like the fact that I don't necessarily know where it's always going to go. It's kind of a mystery in that way. And, you know, character designs, the best ones, are sometimes the concepts that you don't expect you'll wind up with in the end. It either turns out, well, hopefully, ideally, it turns out better than you thought it initially would. If it is going to change at all, hopefully it won't be worse than what you thought it was going to be. But hey, you know, some designs, some ideas that you initially come up with, they're just not going to pan out in reality. You know, it it works in your mind and it seems like it's going to be a good idea, but once it's there on paper, it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, maybe that's not as brilliant and as ingenious as I thought it was going to be. And, that requires a rehashing of sorts, unfortunately, after that. So you can see that we've got a fairly generic, attractive, beautiful looking face for this character that I've sketched up thus far on top of that underlying foundation that we used as our roadmap. And that underlying sketch, which is now turned to blue using the color layer function within Manga Studio. Yes, I am using Manga Studio here. I haven't updated to Clip Studio Paint just yet. But that underlying foundation really holds within it the most important aspects of the drawing. It determines whether or not it's going to work on a fundamental level right from the get-go, whether or not those proportions are going to be correctly measured out, whether or not the general bulk of the anatomy has been shared across the character in the right way, and just on general terms, whether or not the overall anatomy and proportions and positioning, the pose of the character is going to work out. You want to know that before you start placing in the more detailed design elements, because if that underlying foundation is flawed, then everything else is going to be flawed along with it. It is like dressing up a flawed mannequin otherwise. It doesn't matter what clothes you put on it. If that mannequin is out of proportion, then everything else is going to be out of proportion. So it's very important to make sure that you've got a strong hold on the fundamental principles of figure drawing before you, I guess, judge yourself too harshly on the characters that you're drawing. Because look, it's not your fault if you don't know how a character should be proportioned, or you don't have a sound understanding of anatomy and the other things that you add into a character, that you build a character off of in order to make sure that it looks correct to most other people. These are generic aspects of your character design that apply across the board regardless of the design itself. Bad anatomy is bad anatomy from one character to the next. So, get to know what's involved with the structure of anatomy and how a character is properly proportioned. And then, if you want to bend the rules a little bit, then totally feel free to do it. I don't bend the rules a whole lot because I like the idealized proportions and anatomy of the characters that I draw. It just tends to work. It's called the ideal for a reason. It's because it's something that looks good to most people. It may not be different, it may not be unique, but it certainly looks great. And so I build most of my characters off of this idealized model. But that's not to say that, if I wanted a dwarfish looking character or a brutish looking character, I couldn't stretch and deform those established idealized proportions and anatomy to fit whatever idea it was that I was trying to portray on the page. So her design is pretty simple. Skin tight costume, which means a lot of her silhouette will be dependent on the anatomy of the character and how that's shaped. So I want to try to make sure that I'm emphasizing her arms, her legs, her torso with some nice prominent shapes. One of the reasons that I love Jim Lee's work so much is just he's so good at doing that. He stylizes the forms of the anatomy in his characters and just the way in which those contours are laid in. It's vivid on the page. It captures your attention, and it just makes it that much more engaging and impactful on the page. So I try to make sure that I implement that where I can. And with a design like this, you can really have a lot of fun, especially when you're given a decent amount of reference material from whoever is commissioning you. In this case, it was Rob Arnold, so I basically just let him lead the way on that. He sent me a few character designs he sent me a few inspirations for this character design, and I worked as best as I could from them. This was probably a little bit too close to the obviously Star Trek reference that he had sent me. But hey, I worked on it. I came up with a number of different designs for the head tattoos that she was going to have across her face. And there was some pretty cool options there. And in the end, I kind of just let him choose which ones he liked most. It was pretty easy to change them up as needed. And I think that I have fun the most when I'm working on a female character's face, because I've drawn them that many times that I feel like I've established a style for them that I've really gotten to know over the years. And just to draw it is a pleasurable experience for me. I don't know why. It's a weird thing to say, but I really just enjoy drawing female heads and faces in my style. It's maybe a little bit self-indulgent to say that, but I do, and I think when you do hit upon a style that you look at and that you've developed on your own that you like, that's when you enjoy drawing the most. Because the worst part about being an up-and-coming artist is when everything you're drawing just looks crap. It's not it's not coming out the way that you want it to. It doesn't look the way you want it to. You're comparing it to those who have inspired you in the first place, the superstar artists, the pros, and when you're looking at your work in contrast to theirs, it's depressing, to be frank. And there's no better, more rewarding point to get in the development of your own artistic abilities than to be able to draw something, get it down to the page, and have it look the way that you want it to, the way that you always dreamed and hoped that it would look. And I feel like I've been able to strike that with my comic book art style, and I'm very happy about it. I'm at the point in my development as an artist where I don't have to think about it too much more. And I would just say that, if that's not the case for you, and it probably won't be the case for you for a long time, it's consistency and mileage that's going to give you that level of unconscious competence where you don't have to focus on it too much, and that if in fact focusing on it may actually serve as something worse for your art. In other words, the more you think about it, the more likely you're going to be to screw up at that point. So you don't want to overthink things, and now that's the thing that I try to look out for, is I try to just jump into it, draw out what I want to draw out, and trust in the abilities that I've developed up until this point. It's not always easy to do because it depends on your headspace half the time. If you're really if you've pumped yourself up about the next illustration that you're going to jump into and you're kind of hyped about it, then you're going to find that you're a little bit more reserved and hesitant about the decisions you make along the path to the completion of that illustration, which really sucks because it makes the drawing process that much less fun because you're trapped in this analytical mindset then. And that's not why we want to draw. We don't want to draw to analyze the situation. We want to get creative. We want to lose ourselves in the process and create stories, focus on the character themselves, their personality, and bringing them to life. We don't want to be thinking about that technical execution and second-guessing our approach. Although, in the beginning, when you are first figuring out who you are as an artist, what kind of style you'd like your work to be represented in, then you do have to be a little bit more conscious about it. You do have to kind of sit there and work it out, and be wary of when your characters are drawn out of proportion and whether or not the anatomy is ship shape and whether or not the design itself is functional. With a design like this, it's pretty simple. There's a lot of aspects here, generic aspects of the design that I'm kind of just reimagining, such as her belt, the shoulder plate, the boots. I mean, these are things that almost every character design has, most character designs have, that I'm just kind of, giving my own, I guess, decoration to. I'm trying to come up with an interesting look for them, but the element itself is something that is, of course, very, very present in a lot of the designs that are out there. A belt is a belt, and it serves pretty much the same purpose, although for this character in particular, a lot of the elements that I've incorporated into her costuming are decorative in nature. I don't think that belt is serving the purpose to keep her pants up. I think they're staying up all on their own. They're pretty tightly clad around her legs there. So now that I've kind of knocked out the general design for this character, I'm going over the top and refining the contours of her beautiful, luscious locks of hair here, trying to give it some nice shape, implementing those line weights, making sure that there's some variation within the thickness of those contours there. You want it because it makes it look more interesting. It makes it look better. I could get technical with it, but in general, line weights are just going to make your line drawings look that much more better. And the way in which I place them in is I just think about, what direction is the light projecting down, the primary light, projecting down onto my character from? And then on the dark side of the character and the forms that make them up, I try to thicken up the lines a little bit. And also on top of that, the other way in which I use line weights is I try to emphasize the primary focal points of that design. So, in order to really lift the hair up off of the head of the character, I'll give it a thicker outline around the outside of its general shape. So that helps a lot. And, that goes for any other part of her design as well. Again, pointing out the belt and the shoulder pad. There's not a whole lot of different design elements that I've placed into this character. And, the best designs sometimes are the designs that aren't overcomplicated, in my opinion. You take a character like Superman, for example, or just the general, superhero archetype. What are they? They are this. They're tights and a belt and a cape, if you're lucky. And then that's about it. But because they're so simple, they're easy to remember, they're easy to recall. And of course, when you're adding in those saturated, bright primary colors on top of it that contrast against one another, well, that sticks in the mind of the viewer, and they hold on to it for much longer. So, I think that there's this pressure for a lot of comic book artists and character designers to make the characters within their books overly detailed in a design sense. And it's not necessary. Make sure that it serves the character at least. You can't have intricate and complex design elements placed into your characters. That will always look cool. Just make sure that overall it says something about who they are, it adds to their story, and most importantly, that it's broken up in an easily, visually digestible way that the audience is going to be able to recollect later on. Because, of course, a memorable character requires that. Otherwise, it'll be so complex, so complicated that the audience just unfortunately doesn't retain a whole lot of information about your character. So you at least want to emphasize that the main focal points that is within their design, and the elements that make them up. And each one of those elements can be complex, sure. Just make sure that they're emphasized, because that's going to be, again, what makes them more desirable to look at and easily understood. We want to be able to understand what it is you're drawing. If it's hard to figure out, if it doesn't make any sense, then look, I mean, if your character would have to have something seriously interesting going about them if the audience was going to be invested enough to actually sit there and try to figure out what they look like. But of course, that's kind of putting the the egg before the chicken, right? In order for the audience to figure out who your character is and what they're about, they kind of need to see them and understand them on a visual level first. So I'm going over the top of this chick, and I'm adding in those line weights, and you can see just what a massive impact they have to the drawing. They really take it from, a 7 to a 10. And that's how I've always felt about line weights, is they do add that professional level of quality to your work. And although your drawings might be fine without them, and if you're an artist who's been drawing for a while, your art probably does look good, but if you're not incorporating those line weights, give them a go, because you will find that it does take the overall quality in a visual sense of your work up to a whole new level. And I certainly take full advantage of line weights where I can. It makes for a much more readable image, and you're able to lift your drawing off the page with just the contours alone. No rendering or shadows required. Okay, cool. So we're focusing in on the side view, the back 3/4 view, and the direct front view of this character now. Made them a little bit smaller, just to create a pleasing composition for the character's concept sheet overall. And this is the kind of thing that you could place into a comic book, and I'm sure that Rob will, for his saucy version of Star Trek. I'm sure he'll place these concepts in at the end. People love them, especially if they're a fan of your book. They like to see what goes into the creation process behind the scenes. Again, really trying to emphasize the shape of that character's anatomy, those outside contours, the silhouette. That's what people see first. That's where their eyes are going to be drawn to initially. So you want to make sure that, that they're as obvious and as impactful as you can possibly get them. Now, just a few more line weights here and there, a few more tweaks. I like to tweak things a little bit before I call it done. And this concept is good to go. I really hope that you got a lot of value out of today's demonstration. It was just a short one, but it was a sweet one as well. If you like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to visit www.howtodrawcomics.net. Over on the site, we have a ton of written tutorials, video tutorials, of course, a podcast. We even have a podcast. And when you're ready to take your comic art skill set to the next level, you can check out our course selection. Premium, of course, by some of the best instructors out there in the art of comic book illustration. Alright, that's it. Till next time, keep on drawing.